Hello, good morning-ish for you. Morning, afternoon. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Ecological, ecological, sana snet, quaquathmat, sana tain, kiam, tana main. Tui chalachapla, iet skananot, iet squatimatucht, tana silsilala, ithiwanamat tana sila. Eschitchawat tight, iet nakalos, iet ayasneta tana ngankana. Halisen la at iwawa cults. Tiwknil I Justine sit Justing it sin den la at jasap Elxia Gages Stilena. Good day. My name is Tiffany Joseph. My Sinchothan name is Shalaslowit. It was given to me by my cousin Panech and his uncle Jasington, aka Stelquith, aka John Elliott, and my cousin Panech is aka Debo, David Underwood. My parents are Patrick and Ina Joseph. My father is Kiam is his ancestral name, and his parents are late Yvonne and late Willard Joseph and late Yvonne Joseph, and her maiden name was Paul with 2 L's. And her father was late Andy Paul Talt, and he was the first Grand Chief of Canada. And her grandmother was Agnes Lackett Joe, and that was her mother's mother. Her mother's Granny Josie, I think they called her. And my grandfather, late Willard Joseph Squitzimultucht, his father was late Stan Joseph, and his brother was Moses Joseph. So if you know any Josephs from Squamish Nation, y'all pretty much come from those 2 men. I think I should close Facebook. And we're one of the biggest families in Squamish Nation, coming from those 2 men. And there might be some good history to share from that. Maybe I should just share it now while the storytelling about my family is going. So their mother, I believe, was Granny Lizzie. And I think somebody will have to correct me if I'm wrong later. But basically, they had several siblings, but they're the only 2 who survived. And it was really painful for our family, really painful for our family when we heard about that, heard about that loss that our matriarch went through. And I don't really know how or why so many of her children passed away, because they were all children for the most part when they died. And she was a spiritual person, a shaker. We call them shakers in our culture. You'd have to Google Indian Shaker Church to find out more about that. But they say that she wore so many layers of clothes, like every day throughout the year. And when she passed away, she had like this, besides her hands and her face, she had like the skin of a really young person, like in their 20s or 30s, and she lived to a pretty old age. So she's very strong in her spiritual beliefs, and she's remained covered up way because of her spiritual beliefs. But, she raised those two men, and they helped, they brought many beautiful, strong women into this world. And, my father's aunties, because I didn't grow up with my father's father. He passed away when my dad was basically a boy still. They are all incredibly kind and loving people, and so was my grandmother. And so I feel very honored to have been loved by all those women. And the men too, they're all very kind and loving to me. And I imagine that there was sickness that afflicted my relatives who did not get to live, my ancestors who didn't get to live and procreate, which could have been a really, really big family. We're already a really big family already. I can't imagine if they all lived and had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on. And then let's just talk about the Joseph. And my Paul lineage, there's a lot more for me to know. There's a smaller family in that, my grandma and her siblings didn't have as many kids as my grandpa's siblings did. But she was a language revitalist before that was a term. And, all those elders that she worked with were essentially, in our language, her shayat, and maybe some Sachem too, and some Sachs, her cousins, which are in our language, in our culture, that they'd be siblings. And I think she had an auntie too that she worked with. And she was my preschool teacher. So she was my preschool teacher, my younger sister's preschool teacher, and my other younger sister's preschool teacher. And I think she retired when my sister, who's 3 years younger than me, I think she retired that year. But that retirement meant more work, really. And that's usually the case for our elders. I have our Joseph matriarch now, my Auntie Dee, her granddaughter has spent so much time with her, and she said that in her retirement, she's working more now than she was before she retired. And going to my mom's side, Kwakwathemat, from what I can hear in that name, it kind of sounds like talkative lady. And in Sinchothan, even though that's through our Hulkaminam side of our ancestry, to be talkative or like chatty is kind of be like friendly, And you look like you're frozen, so I don't know if I'm frozen. But I'll just keep talking. I'd say my mom's a pretty friendly person and inviting person. My mother's parents are SÁNEĆ and Kotzen. It's really weird to talk while you're frozen. I feel like I want to go check out the feed. Okay, I'm told I'm not frozen. Thank you. I'll keep talking. My mother is Kwakwathemat. She grew up in SÁNEĆ. Her father was late George Underwood, and that's another big family. He was late George. Grandpa was a boat builder, a fisherman. He had 15 children, including my mother, and He built the house for his family, built the furniture. He had to build a table to feed everybody. My grandmother, she's still alive, Tiwanamat, and my niece carries that name as well. And I think my cousin, my niece's mother, might carry it as well. You need to see this message. Sorry. Okay. Emily let me know that something weird's happening with her internet, and she's figuring that out now. But SÁNEĆ is where my mother grew up. And because there are so many kids, they did a lot with farming the land, and the boys got to go fishing, learned how to fish. And my grandmother, Thibanamont, she did a lot of work in the community in SÁNEĆ and Cowitzin. And it's only as I get older that I really understand what she has done throughout her life. And what I do know is that she was doing a lot of that, in times of when women had a lot less rights in society, in the colonial society. And so it was pushing back against a lot of misogyny. And, from what I understand, that was difficult, challenging, and in some ways probably volatile. Hold on. But my grandma, she really taught me, if I ever say anything that sounds like it's complaining, she just reminds me, she's like, well, I had 15 kids. We didn't have money for that. When I got married, we didn't get any wedding gifts. When I was raising my kids, I didn't have a babysitter, so looks like I might have to switch to Instagram Live with Emily. So I'm down with whatever, and I'll see what she's gonna do. But that's a bit about who I am. And I'm sorry, I can't see the Facebook feed or nothing, so we'll see what happens. I think I should close this now and switch to Instagram Live. So Emily will handle that.
Hi, sorry everybody. We had an internet glitch on this end, so I'm just going to bring Tiffany back in to the conversation, which I'm going to send a new link. For those who aren't familiar, I'm using a program called StreamYard to do this live streaming, because if you just Facebook on your phone, even the program, you can't do a joint Facebook Live video. It's actually kind of complicated. You can use Skype or you can use Zoom, but there's a lot of different obstacles. So I'm using StreamYard. Here we are again. Sorry for the interruption, Tiffany. Thanks for your patience. Like, this is just where it is. Internet comes and it goes. Yeah. I'm gonna shut down Facebook. Okay, great. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Back to you.
Yeah. So I actually continued on with my introduction and things like that. So that's probably why it took a while for things to kick in for you. But yeah, I just explained who my parents and grandparents are. And I think the last thing I want to say is who my children are. And so my oldest son, he was just trying to FaceTime me while we were on this call. His name is Chichawatite, and he also has an ancestral name, Tawithit that he shares with many family members. Estichawat means clever boy. And it was kind of like when I was thinking of his name before he was born, asking, my language teachers, my Snachim language teachers, like about some words and possible ways of giving my son a name. Not mean a Stichawat came out of that. It means clever boy, and I liked that because when I was in Squamish language, my teacher would always say that. She'd always say that to us, but because I was kind of willing to be vocal, I'm the one who heard that the most, probably. So, because I really love learning language, and it's probably because my grandma was doing so much language revitalization work that I felt very closely connected to it. So it's kind of like he got to be my junior, and my son Nathan, Nikelos, it kind of means the same thing. When I was looking up more words, had the same translation as a Stichawat. And I was like, well, it's good to give the second-born a similar name as the firstborn because, they'd be fighting like, why does he get to be the smart one? Like, how come I'm not the smart one? So they both get to be the smart one. And what the added context for my son Nathan's name is that Nikelos has sensibility attached to it as well. And my daughter, Ayasnetat, her name makes us peaceful. And so how I came up with that name was that I looked at, I described all the women in my family on my father's side. And I thought about all the teachings that our people had of, a lot of our teachings being lost, but the message coming from my grandmother, Le Yvonne, was that our language isn't dying, it's just asleep, waiting for people to wake it up, and that our culture isn't lost, it's still there, it's just waiting for us to basically engage and participate. If we lost every single ceremony and if we lost every single word of our language, what would we have left? And I think that would be the spirit of who we are. And my grandmother was somebody who made me feel peaceful, and my grandmother's aunties and the grandmothers of her time, everyone described them as so strong. My grandma was so strong, but she didn't think she was as strong as them. And there's a lot of people say I'm strong, and I'm like, I'm not nowhere near as strong as my grandmother's. So it's just something that we continue to say. And I think there's an opportunity for us to look at how we interpret strength, and recognizing that we are adapting in our strength to the current level of healing, from colonization, and also our current ability to put a lot of that, what we feel inside, into words to make that internal external. So my line of grandmothers, and I think of how strong they were known to be, and I look at the world that I inherited and how much that they were able to put so much love and work into the people in the community. And I also, grew up seeing a lot of what they didn't manage to fix and heal in the world. And it's like a lot of times we feel like we have to continue on the same work as the people who left work behind for us, but I think that's a colonial concept, of their matriarchy, or not, sorry, matriarchy, hierarchy and monarchy. And so I was like, well, this is the work that both my grandmothers did that I know of. And what I can do is come back closer to me and value me, because in many ways they were not valued. Not until they, in some respects, women don't get valued and respected until they've reached an elderly age. That's been a truth for the past couple generations. And so, I wasn't going to strive for that. I wasn't going to strive to be loved and respected and all that until I'm 80 or 60. I'd rather, not focus on whether or not I'm experiencing this sort of respect on a societal level, whether that's our own small communities or outside of our community, but rather, do I respect myself? Do I love myself? Am I holding myself to a certain standard, and who can meet me there? And I think that's what women in my family were doing, So I'm continuing that on. Just the work is just looking different. And the adaptation is different. I think of my great-great-grandmother, who was a horse logger, who married a boat builder so he could teach her son and her grandson how to be boat builders.
What's a horse logger, Tiffany?
That's a person who rides a horse and pulls the tree logs out of the forest using a horse.
Right. Literally, it's a horse logger, Emily.
Yeah. And I shared that history with a friend of mine, a settler friend of mine, and she's like, whoa. She's like, that's really scary. Like, it's a really scary job to do.
Wow.
And so I don't know anything about riding horses, but apparently my great-great-grandmother was pretty badass at riding some horses. So. But, that was an adaptation. That's not how we logged horses, obviously, or logged trees. We had a whole totally different way of doing it, but she was adapting. And so what I'm trying to do is adapt to the technologies our people had, because the way we were adapting was that our ways and our beliefs and our worldview is not valued. So I'm trying to adapt to, okay, what would it look like if it was valued?
Thank you. What kind of work have you been involved in terms of the space of Indigenous food sovereignty, whatever term you use to identify that? I mean, the theme of this week's discussions is Indigenous food security. And in the previous discussion, Dawn brought up a good point saying, I don't really like that term because it's very militaristic and it's not really in line with how I would express in my language. So what does Indigenous food sovereignty mean to you? And is that even a term you find useful?
It's, I guess you could say I probably don't find it useful, because it's not from our language. It's not from our worldview. So, but it's something that people can pick up and understand. And if they want to go deeper from that, that's good. But not a lot of people are going to go deeper, and I'm not interested in if you're not wanting to go deeper, but people are at where they're at. So I have a privilege to go deeper in that I'm in my ancestral territories. My whole life I've walked on the lands and walked in the waters that my ancestors on both sides have walked in. And that's a privilege very few have. And so I would think, when I think of what that means in our language, I think of elanganuk. And so a lot of people, when they talk about the places we belong, the first word people say is land. But when I think of that, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable because just because of colonialism and capitalism, automatically, if you start talking about land in a colonial conversation, in a colonial language, it's like, okay, land has value, a dollar value. You can buy it, you can sell it. But we come from a worldview where, no, you can't. You can't buy the land. You can't even buy the air. You can't buy the water. But colonialism has created capitalism in order to be able to buy those things.
Mm-hmm.
You can literally buy oxygen from some
Mm-hmm.
sort of place because it's better there. So elanganok, it more directly translates into like home place. And so who considers the elanganok of the SÁNEĆ people home? And it's not, it's not just us are SÁNEĆ, the plants are SÁNEĆ, the water's SÁNEĆ. People call the Salish Sea because it's, for us as SÁNEĆ people, that's the SÁNEĆ Sea in a way, you could say, because our territory includes Sandwich Peninsula and the Southern Gulf Islands and the San Juan Islands, and we had villages on the mainland, Stuathan, Tawasan, Sumyama, Semyamu, Lummi. And then they have their own name for themselves too. They are our relatives and they're learning Sinchothan. And, I'm doing the best that I can to know how our relatives are identifying themselves. But the plants, the animals, they're all SÁNEĆ. And so how do you take this concept of food and a food system and see it as a system and not just about the one thing having useful things for us to use. That's not our worldview. The plants are our relatives. The land is our relative. The islands are our relatives. Literally in Sinchothan, island is Tlaitchis, which means relatives of the deep. Tlaitchis deep. Tlaitchis would be the relatives of the deep. And in Lekwungen, they have Tlaitchis. I think they either say Tlaitchis or Tlaitchis, and kind of depends on who you're talking to, I guess, but that means relative. So it's the same for both of us to be seeing the islands as relatives. And an example about those islands as relatives and their names, there's a island called James Island, and it's a pretty big island just off the island from Steut. It's known as Tlaltas, but it has a few more names on there, and another one is Teichsung. So Tlaltas means to be splashed on the face, and Teichsung means to be splashed on the neck. So we see these relatives of ours and their bodies with our language as well. We have an island called Sanenus, and there's a Sanenus and a Saninus, and one's just off of Sydney, the town of Sydney, and one's in Brentwood Bay. And one of them means chest sticking out, and they say that was a place where it was the chest of the mother, and we'd bring babies there to bury them and return them to the heart of the mother. If somebody had like a stillbirth or anything like that. And so this food sovereignty or these food systems is recognizing how we need to see all these beings as our relatives, and that includes, the islands, the winds, and each person on the land as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do we relate to one another, and how do we respect one another?
Mm-hmm.
You've been to my territory often, and
Mm-hmm.
I think something that's good that you do is you get to know the people from here. There's so many people, Indigenous people living here, and all, of course, settlers. Everyone who's not SÁNEĆ or in Victoria is a guest here, a settler here in our territories. And how many of them have met SÁNEĆ people? How many of them have met Lekwungen people? How many of them know the different families within these nations?
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say that I am the most most knowledgeable about the families, but I at least know what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I know what I'm supposed to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important for us to figure out what we're supposed to know when we're in another person's territory.
Right.
And, you know, with Shkwanangito, which means doing good work together, we have a guiding group, and that's comprised of 3 people from within with ancestral ties to the 4 nations that we work with. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the people in the guiding group says, like, people don't follow protocol and people don't participate in our spiritual teachings because it's hard. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like it's hard to go up to somebody you don't know and say, "I want to be here."
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's like, well, why don't I just set myself up here and hope nobody notices I'm here? Which is what the original invaders of our lands did. Like, how about I just sneak in and try and camp out here? And all of a sudden, there's a fort, Fort Victoria or Fort Langley, or all these places called Fort on the coast. They
Mm-hmm.
were literally forts created by invaders to our lands who were deciding to um, sneak in and steal and
And
lie.
what did you bring with them, Tiffany?
All those invasive plants.
So this isn't just a beautiful photo of you with beautiful flowers. Can you explain what's happening in this photo?
So, yeah, that's a lot of Dame's rocket. And so, Dame's rocket, people walk through Sneedquith, which is a place I've worked doing invasive plant removal and planting indigenous plants. They love those. It's so beautiful. I mean, like, how could you not? Um, it's a beautiful color and it attracts so many bees. But which is why, like, even I, as somebody removing that, I'm still being cautious. So I'm like, okay, I need to remove this, but I can't remove too much because bees are using this right now. They're foraging. So that's Dame's rocket, and it got pretty tall, like up to my armpit, I want to say. But maybe I just felt overwhelmed. A lot of the plants there in Sneedquith, either they were planted there by the people who squatted in Sneedquith to set up a cement factory. Like, there wasn't just a cement factory there. There's a whole village that included the Europeans who were working for the cement factory, and they had cement foundations for their homes. And there's Chinese laborers who did not have those kind of accommodations. They were living in tents and things like that. And so those places with the cement foundations, they planted gardens around there. So you'll find, like, I think irises or something like that. Like, I'm really bad at remembering the names of these colonial plants because people are like, "Oh, what's that?" And I'm like, it's not from here.
Yeah. Well, then what's this then?
That's kusao, or span. It's another word for it, but kusao is camas. It's an indigenous flower, and it's a food staple for SÁNEĆ and Lekwungen people. We manage the whole territory in terms of the meadows for abundance of this plant. And what that included was prescribed burns. And so when I talk about the ecosystem and the food system and how it's important to recognize what ecosystem and food system you're in, and when I'm describing it as SÁNEĆ, I'm also recognizing that within this whole vast food system of the Camas food system, or the Garioch ecosystem, which is on both sides of the so-called Canada-US border, is that it's all what the anthropologists ended up describing as the Coast Salish territory. That was the first thing I saw, the first thing I noticed when I saw the map of the Garioch ecosystem as I knew it at that moment. And I was shocked. I was like, how much of my life did I hear people saying language comes from the land, and that's why it's so important to learn it? And then I just see a map of this ecosystem, and that's our food, and that's our language group, you know. So with Scrunangito, I actually work within 2 ecosystems at least, because on the island, there's the west coast and the east coast. So a mistake a lot of people make that's understandable, especially if you've ever lived in Victoria, Vancouver, they call the whole coast the Rain Coast. And what people don't know if they've lived in Vancouver and Victoria is that they're not in the coastal rainforests. They're actually in the rain shadow. And so that's what makes this ecosystem so important and so special. So this ecosystem, I'm going to say ecosystem because I know I should be talking about a food system, but it just makes more sense to me to think of it in English as an ecosystem because it removes humans as the center of everything. In this ecosystem, it rains less. Actually, Victoria gets less rain than Osoyoos, gets less rain than Vancouver, a lot less rain than up in Prince Rupert, that's for sure. Less rain than Tofino.
Twin territories, yes.
So an example of a plant that we really love in our territory that it's harder to come by because of all the development in our territory is that, like, Devil's Club. I even have a cousin who has been doing research on Devil's Club for a few years now. It's abundant up in Prince Rupert, is from what I hear. It's like everywhere. It's like sprawling, and it's very revered here. But this ecosystem, because if you think about Coast Salish territory and you think about Vancouver and Victoria and how developed those places are, within this ecosystem, this rare ecosystem, we're within a rare ecosystem. There's only 5% left. And again, when hearing about that scientific fact about the Garioch, aka Camas food system, I was hurt because I was like, there's only 5% of the place where I'm supposed to be able to get food and supposed to be able to reconnect. I cannot access that because only 5% exists. And, you know, also the fact that, like the scientific fact, the statistical fact of Indigenous people being only 5% of all of so-called Canada, I couldn't help but see that reflection of you diminish our ecosystems, you diminish us. And so I wanted to be able to contribute to that land returning. And so I had the opportunity to learn about pollinators, and that deepened that sense of like how if we bring back that which belongs here, it's going to bring, in terms of plants, that's going to bring back so much more of what actually belongs here
Mm.
in our teachings and our culture and our language and our healing. You know, if only 5% of your body is available to heal and be truly indigenous to this, what this place knows itself to be,
Mm.
you know, like
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be so many people who are healing, and there's going to be so many people who don't have that access to that healing because the land has been harmed. So that's what I feel like I want to contribute to the world, to my family,
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, I can't I can't heal them, but I can try and heal the land because I care a lot. And our people are so strong, and they don't always see that because they're just doing what they're taught, just to care for their relatives, care about their family. But it's all on a limit of energy and resources, and they persevere, and so I want to respect them. You know, how dare I say, like, oh, I can help you heal. You know, these are very strong and resilient people, and so what I have been doing is removing my ego from that idea, because, you know, it's through my line of having healers in my ancestry, and that knowing that uh, there's been a responsibility in my families to serve the people, to lift the people up. And the thing is that I think it's just really important. This is what I've learned from my Saanich relatives, is that we're all equal. That's been so, like, that's the way my cousins from here talk about it. We're all equal. There's no hierarchies, you know. And there's people who would dispute that, and I get both sides of that. But really, it's just, we're doing everything to keep us all equal, keep us all balanced. Because if you deal with, you know, the most harmed person and doing your best to lift them up so that they don't get left behind, and also deal with the most well-off person, making sure that they give away all their wealth so that everyone's nourished, and recognize that that's it's an ebb and a flow, and it's a um, you know, we all end up taking turns when you think about it. So in our culture, you know, what I was taught, when, because our funeral teachings are still really strong, is that when a relative dies, you know, our people would go and take care of that family. They really weren't allowed to work. And there's even been people who've talked about our menstruation cycle and said they didn't allow women to work while they were menstruating, and they were taken care of, though. That's the thing, is like, people think, oh, you're not letting me act, and it's like, yeah. That's one of the funny things, is that people are being restricted now due to COVID, and
Right.
it's, you know, they're angry, they're hurt, they're scared, and all this stuff. But from everything I've been taught, it's a lot about restriction. You know, fasting
Mm-hmm.
is a really good example of that a lot of people can connect to. But not acting, you know, if you're not in a good place. And making sure you do the work to care for yourself. That's the thing. Like, right now in a capitalist society, that's a luxury, to be able to care for yourself when you're hurting. And this is what this potentially could be an opportunity for us to do that. Yeah, it's uncomfortable because healing is uncomfortable. Like if you break a bone and you reset it, is that supposed to be comfortable?
Right.
If you get a cut and the skin starts to heal and starts to scab, is that supposed to be unpainful when the scab comes off? If you actually, or if you have a wound and you touch it, like, is it supposed to be not painful? That being said, we have a lot of medicines, of course, to help ease that pain. But what that does require, again, is this relationship. You talk to the plants, you pray to the plants, you have permission from the plant to take its life. Because, you know, and I think about my people is how much they want to give and how the plants, I imagine, have that within them too. And it's like, just ask first. That's all. I just want you to ask first. Like, don't just take me. Like, ask me if I'm cool with this. Because probably most of the time they are. It's just doing that hard thing of just asking. And it's not that hard, but we're all raised in colonialism, so it is hard because colonialism has been that sneak in and take and steal and see what you can get away with and hurt people who want to stop you once you've established yourself enough, like that invasive plant, like the ivy. It made its way in, and you try to take it out, and it's like, sorry, I'm just busy choking your changish. I'm choking out your tsesh. Oh, you don't want me here? But I'm already covering the whole tree. Out here, I just moved here. All these trees are covered in ivy. And I'm like, I want to remove it all. And the landlord is pretty on board. He's excited that I want to do some of these things. I'm also aware, like with ivy, is that if you remove it, like just strip it all, you could kill the tree. It's like, you got to be really thoughtful and methodical. So it could even, like, not quite surgical, but in a way, because you're doing your best to remove it without harming the bark. You know, we have trees that we removed the barks to, well, cedar's an obvious one, remove the bark to make baskets and use the roots to make baskets as well. But we had tons of other barks that we used. And then as Coast Salish people, we kind of get, people are just really shocked at how, like, private we can be. And we don't like to share a lot of our knowledge. And for people who aren't from here, you know, they're like, perceive that as like, I don't think anyone's ever said this about Coast Salish people, but I think it also might be a reflection that they're a little bit scared of us. But, I think they feel this about their own communities, is that there's gatekeeping going on, you know? But I've never experienced that way. It's just like, you have to do the work. Like, just go sit down and ask for that to be shared with you. And learn this not to make yourself bigger, but to, you know, to share with others. Learn to share and not commodify it. And that's a law that our people have been holding on to and practicing as much as they can to this day. And I see this through this work that I've been doing with Shkonangito, is that they're still carrying on. Like, we did an application with somebody and I was trying to reach him. I'm like calling him because we had a deadline with our grant applications. I really don't want to have him miss out on this, because there's people in the community who were also like, hey, I gave Damon your number. I don't know what his name was. I I gave this guy your number so he could call you and apply. So I was like, okay, he's got the family coming around him saying like he wants to apply. So I finally get through to him, and he's like, oh, hey, I couldn't hear the phone. I was smoking fish. And I was like, never apologize for smoking fish. Like, I wouldn't be doing my job correctly if you needed to apologize for smoking fish.
Right.
That's exactly what we're wanting to encourage and promote. So, I can't remember the point. Oh, he was like, well, I can't work because of COVID, so I'm just smoking fish so that we have enough to eat. And I was like, well, that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. So I'm glad that we can help support through this initiative that you have more food to be able to support your family. And there's been so many families there's some new families starting and expanding, I should say. People expecting children, and so excited for them. They're going to be bringing these children into the world with some healthier foods and yeah.
So that's some of the work that you do with the Indigenous Foods Initiative.
Yeah.
And then what other kind of work are you involved in terms of Indigenous plants? And I mean, should we talk about bees now or should we talk about bees later?
We could talk about bees now because this is something that it's kind of funny because I think often people can perceive me or my ideas as radical, and I'm like, but I'm pretty simple, actually. Like, I'm just a pretty simple person, and I've been just feeling around for what feels right to me. And so when I was feeling around to what feels right for me, I ended up connecting with people organizing a Indigenous Foods Conference. And this was years ago. I think it's 2018, I guess. And that happened in the summertime, like June. And in that planning, one of the people involved was like, oh, there's going to be a pollinator stewardship certificate workshop coming up. Would you want to attend? And I was like, it was for land managers. I was like, oh, well, I don't think I technically manage any land right now. And she's like, but they invited me, and then I went and did this 2-day workshop, and I learned mostly about solitary bees. But pollinators includes bees, solitary bees, bumblebees, honeybees. Those 3 distinctions are really important. And but also like bats, moths, butterflies, beetles, a lot of bee words. And we were learning about how they do what they do. And the facilitator is Dr. Laura Morandin. She lives in Victoria, but she works with Pollinator Partnership. Pollinator Partnership. If you go to pollinator.org, that's where they're connected to. And I think they were starting out in the States, and they were expanding up to Canada. And so she just shared all this information. Like, if you ever learn from somebody who's land-based, like especially about plant medicines, like in a way she kind of reminded me of that, where it's like everything you're saying is so important, and there's no way I'm going to remember all that you said, but every word you said is important. And she's talking about bees, but like when I think of plant medicine people and the walks that they give, I give plant walks in a different way because I don't know things the way that they do, but they're just like, this is that plant. And they like stop that. You don't make it far with a plant medicine knowledge carrier because they're just like, this is medicine. Try it. And they talk about like 100 different things of what you can do with that plant or whatever. Right. And so I was like, I can't share that way. One, because I haven't made medicine. Two, I get nerves inside of me. I'm like, I don't want to be the person that people point to and be like, you gave away the plant knowledge medicine, plant medicine knowledge. But also it's just like, there's so much of me wanting to just experience it rather than just be able to spout it off. But at the same time, it's still so fascinating. Like, you're what I think what comes through more, because they say so much so fast, is that you just feel like, at least for me, I just feel all that importance and all that medicine. And so when she's talking about the bees, I was feeling all the importance in the medicine. And I could just feel also the room, like learning and feeling. But I was just also aware that they were not really getting to where I was feeling. And so it's like, there's so much good information here. And there's so many stories here. And I'm like, but they don't hear it. I'm like, I'm the person who hears it. So I'm the person that has to share it. And I really kind of didn't want to share it at first. Like, I really wanted it. I'm like, I need to have all the stories compiled first, because if I don't, then it's not going to have the same impact. But I wrote one story, and one of the reasons I wrote it was because there's somebody like I cared about, and I was like, well, they're having a really hard time. So what if I write this story that's in my heart that I want to share with the world, but I'm a bit too shy or nervous to share it? What if I write it for them? And if that's the one person who hears the story, then, and maybe I can lift them up just a little bit. So if you want, I can share that story.
I would love that.
Okay.
It'll take me off the screen.
Okay. So I usually tell people before I share my stories that I really suck at making titles. So this is just called The Story of Samsamaya. I gotta drink my water first. So there once was a girl named Samsamaya, and she really loved the land that she was being raised on. She'd wake up every morning and acknowledge the day, acknowledge the sun, and pray before she started her work for the day. And then she'd go out on the land and she'd visit every flower and every shrub and sing to them. And as she grew up, they recognized that she had her family recognized she had an interest in native plants as medicines, and so they helped her develop that interest and skill, and she became a person who made medicines for people when they're pregnant. And she also became a mat maker and out of tule and horsetail. And so she's growing up, and she'd assist in all these births and bring all these medicines to these people while they're pregnant and after they had their baby as well. So she got to witness these births, and the mats that she made was there to comfort them while if they ever had to lay down or sit down. And as she got older, she started to develop a baby fever, and her family would get really excited and like, oh, don't you want to have a baby? When are you going to have a baby? And she'd answer like, I don't really know when I'm going to have a baby, because that means I have to get married, and that means I have to go live with whoever I get married to. That means I'll be leaving my homeland. And so she never was really sure if she wanted to get married. But again, she was tending birth after birth after birth, and that baby fever kept coming every time. And so her family would tease her every time, like, when are you going to get married? Oh, don't you want a baby that looks just like you? Don't you want to teach them all the things that you know? And one day she finally kind of gave in and said, okay, yeah, I do. I really would love to have a baby. And so her family got excited, and they got some some men together that she could consider for marriage. And she said, okay, if I'm going to entertain this idea, the man that I have to marry is going to have my favorite plants. And so they bring the first man in, and she says, my favorite flower, my favorite plant is camas. Do you have camas in your territory? And he said, no, I don't. We don't have that. And she said, I can't marry you. You don't have my favorite plant. And then so he leaves, and the next man comes, and she says, do you have do you have camas? And he says, yeah, we do. She's like, okay. Do you have my second favorite plant? It's pupkias, and that's snowberry. And he says, yeah, we eat it all the time. And she's like, oh, I don't want you to be feeding poison to my babies. She's like, I can't marry you. And so she asks the third man if he has those plants, and he says, yes, we have pupkias, but we use that to poison the tips of our arrows for war. And then she's like, she starts being able to envision herself raising her baby with all the foods and the medicines that she knows so well. And so she marries this man in a field of camas in the middle of spring. He stayed with her family for a while, and then he took her to his home village. And he had a first wife, and her name is Kachatla. And Samsamaya was getting to know Kachatla, and Samsamaya shared with her, these are the medicines I make for people when they're pregnant, and these are the mats that I make. And Kachatla, she's like, oh, these are the foods that I hunt for, and these are the blankets that I weave. And she would weave blankets out of mountain copal and dog's hair. And so they'd share this knowledge between one another. And they were talking about like how they would teach this to their children that they are going to be having. And then one day, Samsamaya was like realizing how hard they were both working and learning and sharing with one another, and they were getting so close. And she's like, "Where's our husband?" And Kachatla said, "Oh well, he likes to take things that I make and go and trade them, and seems like he gets a lot of respect from all this stuff, all the food that I catch and the things that I make, and so he's not really around too often." And then Samsamaya's like, wait, when I got married, we had all these gifts, these blankets and food to give away to everybody. Did you harvest all that? Did you make all those blankets? And then Kachatla says, yeah. And so Samsamaya realizes that's not a life she wants for herself. And so she is sad and decides she tells Kachatla that she has to go back home because she doesn't want that life for herself or her child. And so they make a trade. Samsamaya gives mats and medicines to Kachatla, and Kachatla gives her blankets and food that she hunted to take home. So she gets home, and she's starting to feel a bit of weight, and then because she's so well known as a mat maker, the people, it's starting to get cold, so they say, can you give us some mats? And we didn't make enough for the winter. And Samsamaya obliges, and she said, this is everything that I have that you can have. Take it, don't ask me for more, because I have to take care of me and my baby now. So she's, alone, and it's winter now, and she's feeling the sadness of what she had gone through for the past year. And she's just taking that time to feel it, because she doesn't feel it when she's out on the land gathering those medicines. She doesn't feel it when she's tending to those births. It's such a sacred time. And so when she's alone, that's when she feels it. And sometimes it gets too much. She's crying and she needs help. So she grabs that snowberry. That's her second favorite plant. And she puts it in the water, infuses the water with it, and she washes away her tears with it. And when she needs to cheer herself up, she starts to hum. And she's, rubbing her belly and talking to her tummy, and she's like humming this song to her baby, because she knows that she's going through a sacred time, and she wants that baby to know that even when you're sad, you can lift yourself back up. And she starts remembering all the flowers and all the berries and all the good experiences she has when she shares those medicines with people. And she says to her baby, like, there's so much beauty in the world, and I don't think people see it. I hope you have eyes just like me. And she brings this baby into the world. She lives a full life, raising her children with the teaching she was given. And she just really loved the land her whole life. And she's like on her deathbed, and she's remembering all the things that she experienced, the ups, the downs, and how it was listening to those teachings, those laws of the land that were shared to her from her family and from the land itself. And she's just praying, remembering all of that, and she's praying so hard. I hope, I hope that future generations, my children, future generations, anyone here on this land is going to remember all these teachings and how beautiful it is, and how if you put all this love and respect into the land, it comes back to you. And that's how this system works. I pray so hard that people understand that, and not in that intellectual level, but in here. And she's praying so hard, and then she transforms into the bee so that she can carry on that teaching generation after generation. And that's the story. There's lots of, when I talk about that pollinator workshop, all the bee knowledge that I was picking up, it's in that story. So even I hope you have eyes just like me is a little flag for people to, if you're a teacher wanting to teach about solitary bees, there's solitary bees have different eyes than wasps and flies. And so if you can look at the eyes of the bees, that's one identifying thing. And the reason why she loves her land so much is solitary bees, they can only forage 50 to 100 meters from their nest. Most of us are familiar with honeybees. Honeybees are from Europe and Asia and Africa and maybe other continents as well. And, they're very industrialized. That's what a lot of us don't really understand, because we think we see honeybees kind of everywhere during flowering season, right? They're coming from beehives that are managed by beekeepers. And even if we think we're seeing beehives, we're most likely seeing wasp nests. We're not seeing this like beautiful beehive producing honey. We're seeing this like wasp nest of terror. So these honeybees are kept. Isn't that like, that's a really uncomfortable, like, it's like you're being kept. Like, it's really uncomfortable to me. But solitary bees, like, you can't keep them.
Right.
They make nests in the ground. They make them in kind of grassy spots, like that's what the bumblebees do. And they make them inside of plants. Like, if I almost want to go grab a stinging nettle thing, but I won't today. But the inside of stinging nettle stalk, it's small. Like, there's bees small enough to live in there. So, the solitary bees, that her wanting to stay on her land is like, that's what solitary bees do. They're not going to go from Husainich to, like, from Sycam to Pachudat, which is where I happen to work. That's just not what they're going to do. You're taking care of the solitary bees 50 meters from you. in a radius, or 100 meters from you in a radius, how many people would you have to talk to create that habitat for solitary bees? Honeybees, they can go for miles and they don't really need a special habitat because, as I said, they're being kept, and they'll forage anything. Solitary bees, they'll pollinate other things, but they can only survive where there's native plants. And so if you're, planting a wildflower mix that you get from a landscaping store, that's not native plants. That's the kind of funny thing about wildflowers. When people talk about, oh, I planted wildflowers for the bees. I'm like, huh? Like, if no one's using the word indigenous, they're not really knowing what they're talking about when it comes to supporting bees, and which is pretty lovely when you think about, like, if you're not thinking about indigenous plants, you're also not thinking about indigenous people. So if you are thinking about indigenous plants, you're forced to think about us, which can be uncomfortable for people. Which is why I say I'm not radical. I'm just making you look at something you don't want to look at.
Well, the term radical has been used quite strategically throughout different times and different cultural spaces. I mean, I think like people saying, well, it's radical to want equity. That's radical. And it's like, good. Well, then I'm radical. That's great. Some of the best people I know are radical, right? The radical idea that we're out of balance, the radical idea that we can do better, the radical idea that the systems of power in place are corrupt, right? I mean, I'm okay with that. Great. I think capitalism is radical. I think colonialism is radically backwards and dehumanizing, right? I think these ideas can also be called radical.
And like wild, there's a lot of indigenous land-based educators who are not fond of the word wild, but if anything's wild, colonialism's wild and out of control. Out of control.
Right.
So
that's a good point, right? Because I think the way the term wild has been used, whenever you have wild, there's this accompanying thought or belief that it needs to be tamed or controlled, right? And in some ways, like looking at observing nature and observing different ecosystems, there's a lot of time there is control. There is, like, within ecosystems, there is reciprocity and relationship. It's not just this totally unhinged, wild, system, but words, words, Tiffany. Well, we're going to kind of come full circle here. Is there anything else that you want to share? I mean, it can be really anything, just what's on your heart, thinking about COVID times, any message that you just want to share right now in this space that we have.
I think I've been talking for almost 2 hours. Hey, that's pretty classic of me. Bring the Coast Salish person in, and I want to go for a 4-day ceremony.
Just to interrupt you really quick, that reminds me of when you told me about going to like non-Indigenous organized events where people ask you like, okay, Tiffany, we have 2 minutes for your introduction and then we need to get right into things. And you're like, no, like I can't introduce myself in 2 minutes. Like, are you serious? How have you been able to deal with that kind of cultural, like big cultural difference?
I have like a privilege of being able to kind of like sort of shock people anyway. If that makes sense? So like, it's good to be able to do introductions, but in a good way, but in the right space. Like this felt like a right space to share because there's a understanding between both of us. And there's also what a lot of settlers who are considering themselves settler allies do is like have this weird flex of like they know their genealogy, but So I'm like, well, if I try to hold everyone to that standard, it doesn't mean that people aren't going to try to do some weird flexes, you know? So I just, instead of bringing in that deep protocol for an opportunity for people to objectify it, I rather just like, well, you're not ready for this, so at least I can just go right to your heart in a uncomfortable way often, because people are afraid to be in touch with their heart. And I just deal with it that way.
Radical Tiffany.
But yeah, I think, what do I want to share? I want to share the importance of shkonangito, because, again, I think I get treated as radical in the way that I'm working my involvement in it, but we're really doing, like, we as in who Katie George, who I work with, Katie George Jim, is trying to give power to the people and to make their choices and their decisions. Because, I know a lot about bees, and I know a lot about native plants. But the biggest mistake of colonialism, and who all those who've been tools, whether they wanted to be or not, is that they've taken away that relational decision making. And so we are doing our best to connect to people and hear what they're saying and what their needs are, and just bring what we have to give to that. And it also is requiring some learning to share. But I think the struggle has been that in this relational work, I have had to, for the past 12 days, be in self-quarantine, not able to leave this house. Like, I could get fined $1 million or something if I leave. I can't go to the grocery store. And, I think about my relatives, my great grandmother, who had so many children that she lost. And I'm sure she felt confined, and she had to rely on other people to help, because she was following teachings much more strongly than I was. And how, no, this is your time to ask for help. I think one of people that I know in my community is, like, the people who work the hardest often don't like to ask for help, because they're spending so much energy helping others.
Right.
So just wanting to support these people, because they are strong and they have a reason to be proud. So just create more resources around them, more medicine around them, because they're going to continue doing what they're doing. So all you have to do is just put more of the medicines close to them, so that they figure out whatever they need to figure out. Because if I try to tell them any different, they're going to just be like, what are you talking about? You don't know what I'm dealing with. And it's true, I don't. A lot of times, Katie, we talk about what we're doing in our communities, and she describes it, we're just little Coast Salish babies. Like, a lot of people describe me as strong or powerful or whatever, and I'm like, I'm barely scratching the surface of what women in my community are really doing to confront these things really head on, and be in the thick of a lot of things. So, and one day their stories, I hope I have permission to share them in a good way, not with a greater public, but just within our community, because they they are so strong, and they do a lot to care for themselves too, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful things that I see. And I'm just so humbled, and I'm so sensitive. So like I cry about it a lot. I'm like, oh, so beautiful.
I'm right there with you. I'm right with you. Oh, water.
Yeah, I think that's most of what I want to share.
Hi. Thank you so much for your
Mhm.
time today. I know there's a lot going on. It's not always easy to schedule these kinds of things in the middle of life, right? To be like, on this day, are you going to be okay to jump on? And can we have it? It's like, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to rain. The internet leaves when it rains here, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm just really grateful for your time and patience today and everything that you shared. Folks are saying thank you for sharing your stories and your language and just putting that out there, on the great big face or book of faces, this world of Facebook. It's good to hear you speaking your language and sharing a story with us. And this knowledge, you really changed the way that I think about bees, and the way that I think about, okay, if I see a solitary bee and that bee is caring for its local territory and that bee relies on Indigenous territories and Indigenous plants, and if we, look to the bees, because the conversation around Save the Bees has been a little bit misguided. Like, what bees? What are you talking about? That's a bigger conversation to have. Yeah. So, anyways, I'm very grateful. Go ahead.
We have a fundraiser going on so that we can
Okay, great.
reach more homes with our Shkwanangito garden initiative. So, people are growing native plants and veggies together in SÁNEĆ, Lakwangin, Tuk, and Nuchanoth, which is the so-called CRD, Capital Regional District. And we just have a link it's on Canada Helps to fundraise so that we can buy soil or buy that fish compost, or some people need more to build their greenhouse. So yeah, if anybody's able to help in any kind of way, they also need volunteers. If you are like, we have planter boxes, well, can you bring them directly to some of these people? Because especially in Pachuca, it's really far, and so it's got to be portable and be able to drive on the highway with that.
So is this website the best way to be in touch if people are able to support the food initiative?
I would say our email address, info@indigenousfoodsinitiative.com.
Great. I'll put that up here.
Yeah, and there's also the Shkwanangito Facebook page.
Yeah.
I think Katie tagged it.
Great.
So there was an article about different, this journalist did growing your groceries or something like that, and he interviewed one of our gardeners. So that's Terry Barnhard. And that was shared over 100 times, I think. So,
amazing.
What our people are doing is pretty inspiring.
Absolutely. Well, and it's just good to have these good conversations around solutions, right? Like sometimes I hear conversations, between folks, all kinds of different people, but where it's like, what are we going to do? Let's start having these conversations. It's like, there are solutions. There are people that have been talking about these very issues for a long time, right? And so it's important that we look to the solutions. And so I think, looking at Indigenous food sovereignty solutions and what's been happening, hearing about what Dawn's been involved in, and Jess and yourself, and it's good to hear about these projects and support them, right? It's like, what do we do? Support the work that's happening, that's already happening, is a great place to start. So thank you. Yeah, thank you again. I won't take up too much of your time. I'm sure we could just hang out and talk story for a long time.
Yeah.
hopefully I'll be able to visit again sometime your beautiful territories. You know, I got pretty hooked. I would just show up to your house.
Yeah.
Hello, can I hang out again? And I miss your family and that good hospitable energy. Everybody very welcoming and loving. And, you know, that little archery group we had going. So
Yeah.
soon enough, we'll be hanging out again.
Yeah. Totally.
Take good care of yourself.
Yeah. Kwanzaa.
Mm.
It takes
Hi,
care.
hi.
Yeah.
Okay, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.